Hey everybody, we're looking here at chapter 16, biotechnology. So we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit. We're going to continue with genetics in terms of content, but we're going to switch a little bit and start looking at the futuristic kind of applications of molecular biology. So in other words, what is it that, we're doing in lab type settings like you see in this image here, in order to modify living things in a way that is beneficial for human use, whether it be consumption or research, or whatever. And so that's kind of what chapter 16 will end up being about. So when we hear the word biotechnology, a lot of times we think about the technology as it applies to and impacts living things like us, right? And other types of living things as well. So as always, get the title here, and then we're going to do section 16.1 today. So if we look at 16.1, the title here is Changing the Living World, and I have a picture here of a whole bunch of dogs, and those are here because I wanted to kind of start us off today in thinking about where we've come from in terms of not, as humans, but I'm saying where we've come from in terms of our knowledge of hereditary patterns and inheritance and, where we're headed with our understanding of these new biotechnologies. So all the dogs that you're seeing here are all examples of different types of dog breeds. But as you probably know, all dogs belong to the same general species, which means that any of these dogs, depending upon the sexes of these dogs, can mate and potentially have fertile offspring because they're all of the same general group. Even though they have many different phenotypes and characteristics and even behavioral traits, they generally still have the ability to produce fertile offspring because they still belong to the same general group. Okay. So we get dog breeds through this process called selective breeding, and that's going to be the first objective here. And then we're going to also add in here what variation has to do with these breeding practices. Okay. So selective breeding is what was used. Let me scoot back in creating all of those different dog breeds that you saw in that first slide. And, you can think of plenty more beyond that. It's not just that grouping, right? But the same would apply to cats and all sorts of different types of livestock and domesticated animals that have been bred really for specific purposes. So selective breeding is your first vocab term here in this chapter. And this is this idea where humans are kind of taking on the role of choosing which traits they want to see in offspring. So it's almost as if they're kind of playing God in this case, right? They're choosing which offspring to breed, which ones to keep around, which ones to use to create more offspring in the future, okay? So it's generally just, the process by which humans are going to breed organisms that have specific traits. This is not introducing anything new. So when I talked about, we're going to get to this futuristic type of stuff, this is not futuristic. When we talk about selective breeding, this is simply what's been done ever since humans started farming. So when we entered the agricultural revolution centuries ago, selective breeding was something that was being done at that time, and it was done to try and increase yields, numbers, quantities, appearances of the crops that were being grown. And the same would apply to animals, right? So we raised lots of different types of animals to help with that farm work. And then in addition to that, we raised other animals for other purposes as well, like for consumption, right? Pigs, cows, and so on. But even though it doesn't include kind of these futuristic things, selective breeding is what we call genetic engineering. It's one type of that. We're going to talk about several different ones in chapter 16, but this is kind of our first example. And when we talk about genetic engineering, this is essentially just meaning that we are engineering, we're kind of creating, we're developing our understanding and creating solutions to problems that humans had seen potentially in the past. So we're using our understanding of how traits get passed down from one generation to the next to create more reliably producing crops, okay, more reliable yields, more consistent types of produce and vegetables and so on. Okay, but again, we're not introducing anything new here. This is simply selecting for traits that are already present in a population and then breeding only those organisms that have those specific traits to again see them in the next generation that follows and beyond and beyond. So two of the techniques that we use as part of this process are what you're seeing on the screen here, hybridization and inbreeding. And when we talk about a hybrid, generally what we think about is two different individuals kind of mixing, right? It could be two different animals. It could be like a car that runs on electric and regular fuel. But we're mixing two potentially very different things to create one thing that has kind of both parts, right? So when we talk about making hybrids in terms of selective breeding, what we're doing is we're crossing unique individuals, what we would call the unique parents, to create offspring that have both sets of traits. So the example I'm using in class is with strawberries. So strawberries naturally, the ones that grow out and are wild, as we would call them, the ones that just grow out in nature without us, physically planting seeds in our backyards and our gardens. Those wild strawberries tend to be really small. They also tend to be green, and if they turn red, they're not super sweet, but they may look kind of appealing. You've maybe seen these growing alongside of sidewalks or green belts or the roadways or even out in your backyard. Like in my backyard, we have lots of weeds, and some of those weeds produce these strawberries, and they are totally edible. They just don't taste that great, but you can eat them. Those little strawberries, which are really no bigger than like the size of a pea, they're super small, are naturally what we get. If you just allowed strawberries to produce on their own, that would be the type of strawberry that we would see out in the environment. But farmers and really any type of human being throughout the world knows that we would rather prefer to have larger fruit, right? It's a lot more appealing for us. And if it's big, bright red, it's going to be even better. So when we talk about creating strawberry plants that are consistently producing the biggest and reddest fruits, the way that was done is farmers historically would take plants, as these strawberry plants that they noticed produced bigger fruits, and they would save those seeds and they would continue to grow those plants that would hopefully over time produce even bigger and bigger and bigger fruits. And then over here, they would have another set of strawberries that they knew would consistently start producing the reddest strawberries, and they would continue to breed those. So they got red, 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 red. Now, where hybridization comes in is they would take those two offspring from each of those groups, the one with the reddest strawberries and the ones with the largest strawberries, and cross those, right? Just like Mendel with his peas, right? He would take pollen and kind of paint it onto the pistil of the other plant. And in doing that, they're going to create a bunch of offspring. Farmers at that point, what they would do is they would pick and choose the ones that had both the biggest fruits and the reddest fruits, and then they would save those and then go through this process of inbreeding. So hybridization is taking two very different parents and crossing them to get traits, both traits present in the offspring. And then inbreeding kind of follows that, where you take those offspring expressing both of those traits and mate them with each other, right? Plants are super easy, if you remember, to do this with, because they have the ability to self-pollinate. They have both a male gamete pollen and a female gamete. And so pollen can literally just drop from the stamen and fertilize the egg there, what we would call the egg, right? And then that can create the seeds that are used to produce more plants, right? So inbreeding is an important part of this because it ensures that those same traits get passed on and are consistently showing up. These are two techniques that were used centuries ago and are continuing to be used. So we still do this to a large extent on farms all over the world. And that's not just with vegetables. It would include animals of specific types and with certain traits and so on and so forth, right? Like we could talk about cattle, for example. We have dairy cattle and we have Angus cattle that are used for meat. And those cows, if you've ever seen them, or if you could put them next to each other, you would notice phenotypically, appearance-wise, they look different. And the reason for that is because of the traits that we've chosen to kind of breed and see in each group of cows, okay? So another example of that here is with green leafy vegetables, like you see. Maybe not your favorite vegetables. They're not my favorite, I will tell you that. But we have used selective breeding to create the 6 varieties of vegetables that you see here. So what this started with was this original wild plant that grew in Europe, kind of, again, like wild strawberries alongside roadways and in yards. And for most people, this was just like a weed that nobody wanted to have to deal with. So they'd chop it down when they mowed their grass and so on. And so when we look at this, if you'll notice, it doesn't look an awful lot like any of these over here, except for the leaves that we can kind of see in kohlrabi and maybe in kale. But beyond that, none of this really resembles Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, or broccoli. And what's been shown to happen is farmers essentially took this wild growing plant called brassica, and they kind of coaxed it into becoming all these different types. So they would choose the naturally occurring variations in, let's say, the amounts of flowers, and they would pick the amounts of flowers, pick those plants that had the greatest amounts of flowers, and inbreed them over and over and over again, till we ended up with these two things over here, broccoli and cauliflower, which are basically a bunch of flowers, right, that have been produced in this case. Now, different colors and different general shapes and tastes, but that was selected for after we got plants that produced lots and lots of flowers. And again, their ancestor was this brassica wild mustard plant, okay? Kohlrabi and kale, we're selecting for lots of leaves. Cabbage and Brussels sprouts, kind of same thing, but these are leaves that are kind of, folded inwards and knotted. And Brussels sprouts, if you've ever eaten those, are essentially like little tiny cabbages anyway, right? So those would make sense that they're very similar. So what we're seeing in selective breeding is, again, humans selecting for these traits that we feel are most advantageous for us, right? It's kind of this selfish perspective in a way, but it's been really helpful if we think about it in a positive light. It's been really helpful for us because it's allowed us to improve upon our diets. It's allowed us to produce more food at a greater efficiency, right? And so this selective breeding is something that's been kind of revolutionary when we think about human existence and our ability to support our ever-growing population size, right? So we talked about dogs, and cats would fit in the same category here. All these cat breeds have been created through, again, selective breeding practices. Angus cattle versus dairy cattle, I mentioned that to you. And then Clydesdale horses are another one. There are lots of different types of horses as well. Clydesdales are not racing horses. They are almost the opposite of that. They're very big, very strong, kind of muscular. They were originally bred to kind of pull carts and pull wagons. And you may have seen them in things like a Budweiser commercial years ago around Super Bowl time, right? Where they're carrying, actually, maybe even before that, because it was usually for Christmas, but they're pulling these carts, right, in the snow, and these big, thick hooves, and again, they're just these massive animals. So they were clearly bred for that purpose, as were other types of dogs and chickens and all sorts of different livestock species, okay? So actually, that's all I have for 16.1. It was short. So I will catch you back here next time for the next screencast. But other than that, if you need anything, as always, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you then. Bye.